So concept 2 of Reconstruction is to discuss the presidential plan for Reconstruction and show how its weaknesses led to the Congressional plan of Reconstruction. In the proclamation of December 8th, 1863, Lincoln formulated what was to be the plan for the presidential plan for Reconstruction. The objective of Lincoln's plan was to get the people from the seceded states back into their normal relations with the federal government as quickly as possible. The tool Lincoln would use was his presidential power of pardon. As stated under the discussion on the proclamation, Lincoln's main objective was to preserve the Union. He felt that trying to get a pound of flesh from the South after the war, which is what historically happens after civil wars, would only keep the nation divided longer and would not provide any common good for the majority of Americans. The South would only resist black equality and thereby delay the healing process of the nation's wounds. Hence, Lincoln found it to be in the best interest of the nation to use his presidential power of pardon to get the seceded states back into the normal relationship with the federal government as quickly and painlessly as possible. In using his power of pardon, Lincoln provided for a general amnesty and restoration of property other than slaves to most of those who would take a prescribed oath of loyalty to the Union. Furthermore, whenever 10% of the electorate of 1860 took this oath, a state government would be established, which Lincoln promised to recognize as the true government of the state. They could hold constitutional conventions and draw up and ratify new state constitutions that abolished slavery, and the people within the states were then prepared to have their own state resume its normal place within the federal union. This would be done after they reconstructed state governments and elected officials to both the House of Congress and at the federal government. Lincoln's plan was used in Tennessee and was promptly adopted in Louisiana and Arkansas. But as always, all was not so easy, as Congress, which is the judge of its own membership, refused to admit the representatives of the reconstructed states. The states were brought into the Union under President Lincoln's plan. In the presidential election of 1864, their electoral votes were not counted. The congressional reaction to Lincoln's plan was obviously not positive. The congressional leaders had a plan of their own which carefully retained control of the entire process of Reconstruction in Congress's hands. However, the assassination of Lincoln in April of 1865 ended his program and brought in Vice President Andrew Johnson to the White House with the second phase of the presidential plan of Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson's rise to the presidency drastically altered the political situation, although, like Lincoln, he viewed the restoration of southern states as presidential, not as a congressional function. Johnson was a Democrat from a seceded state. He had been placed on the same ticket with Lincoln in 1864 to emphasize the unionism of the Republican Party. Like John Tyler in 1854, Johnson was the nominal head of the party, of which he was not a member. Few, if any, presidents ever faced more of a difficult situation than Andrew Johnson. Johnson had no personal following with the American people, either in the South or the North, nor did he have any prestige that came to Lincoln from the successful conduct of the war. Finally, Johnson had no party organization behind him for he had broken with the Democratic Party and had not been fully accepted by many Republicans. In the beginning, however, some radical Republicans did rejoice in the death of Lincoln and the accession of Johnson, as a quote from Representative George Julian of Indiana indicates. Quote, "I spent most of the afternoon in the political caucus, and while everybody was shocked at his murder, Lincoln's, the feeling was nearly universal that the ascension of Johnson to the presidency would prove a godsend to the country. Aside from Mr. Lincoln known policy of tenderness to the rebels, his views of the subject of Reconstruction were as distasteful as possible to radical Republicans," unquote. Immediately upon his accession to the presidency, John appeared willing to cooperate with radical Republicans. Johnson stated that, quote, "treason is a crime and must be punished," unquote. But once Congress was out of session, he started moving in a sharply different direction. This was partly because Johnson viewed Reconstruction as presidential, not a congressional function. Like Lincoln, Johnson was also self-educated and self-trained. He had a powerful, though not well-disciplined mind. Combined with these intellectual qualities were the virtues of integrity, devotion to duty, courage, and belief in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. But at a time when tact and flexibility were called for, he was stubborn and very inflexible. Johnson's own blunders isolated him not only from radical Republicans, but from the party of moderates. As a result of these blunders, the radical Republicans, who were a minority in the outset of Johnson's administration, continued to gain strength and would soon become a majority. After Johnson had settled down to the heavy duties of his new task, he attempted to carry out what he understood to be Lincoln's policies, omitting, however, the 10% aspect of his predecessor's program. He had only two objectives: union and freedom. He, like Lincoln, never subscribed to the radicals' demand for equality. Radical Republicans demand for equality for black Southerners. On May 29, 1865, Johnson announced his policies on two basic principles of Reconstruction. One, pardon and amnesty, and two, Reconstruction procedure. As with Lincoln's proclamation of December 8, 1863, a limited pardon was extended which excluded various classes such as those that who had held civil office under the Confederate government and those who had mistreated prisoners. Lincoln also excluded those Southerners who had taxable property exceeding $20,000 in money back then. Those who accepted from general pardon by Johnson, there remained the possibility of special pardon by petition. And much of Johnson's time was occupied in granting of thousands of these special pardons. In fact, throughout his administration, Johnson granted pardons to former Confederates in wholesale lots and even replaced several district military commanders whose radical sympathies offended him. During his 3 years in office, Johnson proclaimed 3 executive amnesties, each more liberal than the former. As one of his last acts in office in December 25th, 1868, Johnson proclaimed was an unconditional pardon for all Southerners, including Jefferson Davis. So these were just big wholesale pardons, basically he was dishing out. In the Reconstruction process, beginning with North Carolina, Johnson picked up where Lincoln left off as he proceeded to appoint provisional civil governors in all Confederate states where Lincoln had not already done so. The states were reconstructed under Johnson in the same manner as they were Lincoln, right? They had a new electorate with no blacks voting. Southern whites would be the ones voting, with some ex-Confederate leaders, which Lincoln did not have. They would have a new constitution. They would have elections both at the state and federal level, if according to Johnson's plan. By December 1865, regular civil administrations were functioning in all of the former Confederate states except Texas. Johnson's purpose was to return the American system to normal. The process involved direct personal cooperation between Johnson and the leaders of the state reorganizations in the South. Southern delegations conferred with Johnson in person, acquainting him with local conditions, presenting unforeseen problems, and receiving his direct pledges of reconciliation. In conclusion, the ease and speed in which Reconstruction was taking place excited distrust in the North in three main areas. One, every one of the Southern state conventions rejected Lincoln's and Johnson's suggestion that the vote be extended to a few well-educated blacks. Lincoln and Johnson did nothing to force the issue. Two, the second problem occurred only during the Johnson administration, when many ex-Confederate leaders were elected as officers to the restored state governments. Southern whites chose to office the natural leaders of their section, men who had been prominent in the military or civil service of the Confederate States of America. For example, the legislature of Georgia elected as their United States Senator Alexander Stephens, the late Vice President of the Confederate States of America. Congress's final concern was the allowance by Johnson of a series of laws called black codes that were passed throughout the South that restricted black people to second-class citizenship, effectively, basically, creating de facto slavery, arresting people for vagrancy, and the way they would pay off their fines is that they would go work for a plantation. And then there they would probably receive more years under their servitude, right? So all of this is basically creating a huge pending fight between Congress and the executive. And now that Johnson is basically micromanaging the whole process of Reconstruction, coupled with the fact that he was not politically popular in the country, for the reasons stated, is going to really give Congress an incentive to take over the entire process of Reconstruction, which we'll look at in Concept 3. So see you there.